Welcome to this programming user interface lecture. Today we're going to look at CSS animations. And so CSS animations may sound like something very kind of frilly or elaborate where you're going to be animating like traditional animation or something like that. But really when we're talking about CSS animation, it comes down to adding certain kind of polished effects to the user interface. So things that help with navigation and kind of feedback and stuff like that. Of course, you can take it to the extreme and do very large kind of like animations and lots of various kind of interactive uh, abilities or kind of features to the site. But at the core of it, it's kind of a nice way to add some more polish to the user interface to the UX. And so the CSS animations are fairly new comparative to the CSS standards, and they are better than animating with JavaScript. So before the CSS animation properties came around, you had to use JavaScript to do these sorts of animations. And because that they've become native or built into the browser, they become much more efficient, and you can do much kind of smoother animations and more efficient animations because they're part of the standard and they're built in. And there are a couple of ways of doing these animations. The first we're going to look at is basically by defining a transition property. And so this basically tells CSS that there should be a specific property that you want to apply a transition to, and whenever it changes, then it should transition between the two values that you set that property to. The catch with this is that you need to trigger that change somehow. You need to like initiate that change being transition between. And so this is often done with JavaScript. So setting up a change kind of event, or you can do it with a pseudo class or some sort of CSS class. So for example, adding a hover property would initiate a change in values. And so this will make more sense if we take a look at an example. So say we have an ID here called delay, and it has these base properties set. So font size is set to 14 pixels. If you add this transition property value to it, you're basically saying, hey, CSS engine, watch this property called font size, and whenever there's a change to it, make the change, but do this transition to that change, right? And so there could be a transition duration and a transition delay. And so in this case, we have a pseudo hover attribute added to it. So when there is, a cursor hovers over this, the font size is going to switch to 36 pixels. But because there's a transition assigned to it, it's going to transition during, take 4 seconds to do it and start 2 seconds later. So let's do this together, for example. Let's make a new glitch. I'm just going to make a new hello world here. And so we can, you can transition anything. You can apply this property to any CSS property that you have. So let's make a div here. And we'll call this div with an ID or a class or whatever. You could use whatever you want. So we're going to say ID any div hello, right? And so we have this simple div here. So let's make it a little more fancy. I'm going to add some style. Block in the code, and we have our any div, and let's make it a certain size, right? So we'll say the width should be 200 pixels, and the height should be 200 pixels, and the background color should be tomato. Right, so then we have this div here. Let's make it 100 and 100, make it a little bit smaller. And we'll add some padding, internal padding to it. All right, so this is a defined style, right? So it has these properties that we just set. Let's add a font size. So it's 1 EM. And so what we need to do if we want to animate the transition of these properties somehow, we need to turn that watch that little toggle switch on for this specific property. So we need to say we want to add in our transition information. So we say, okay, I want you to watch out for this transition property, and that property is what you want to animate, right? So let's say we're going to animate the background color when it changes. So background color. And then we can add these more metadata about that transition animation. So we can say transition duration should take 4 seconds or 2 seconds. So 2s, s stands for seconds. And so now, whenever the background color is changed, then it's going to say, oh, I'm watching this transition property, and I know I need to transition it between the two values, but it's going to take 2 seconds. And so the only other thing we need to do is add some event or something that changes the background color so that this transition, so we can actually see it. So like I said, you could do this with JavaScript by changing the CSS style or the class or the ID it belongs to. But we're just going to add a hover just to quickly demonstrate this. So when you hover over this div, we wanted to change the background color from tomato to, let's say, a white. So when if there was no transition property enabled, right? So let's comment these out. When I hover over this, it would just go straight to white, right? But because we have these transition properties enabled, when you hover over it, it changes to white gradually over the course of 2 seconds, right? So there's other things you could add, like transition delay, 5 seconds. So 5 seconds is, it will wait 5 seconds for it to actually start changing. Right. You can also, instead of using seconds, you can use microseconds, which there's 1,000 microseconds in 1 second. So if you want sub-second kind of accuracy or try to get there, you can do that. So you can say, okay, 500 milliseconds or microseconds, and it will, that's half a second. And so if you wanted to animate various different properties, you could add them in. Or if you wanted to change, animate all of the properties, anytime any property is changed, you could change this from the specific property name to the word all. And so basically any change in them will take that long. So if I made the font size, or if I made the width a little bit bigger, the width and height to 200 pixels, when you hover over, since this is set to all, it will affect those properties as well. And so what's nice is, right, like you don't have to think about what the colors would be between red and blue, right? Because that's a complicated kind of notion of color gradients and stuff. The browser just figures it out for you and does it, and it automatically transitions between them. So it's really kind of a powerful way to add these sort of animations to your CSS. So there are some other properties you can play with. So you can change the transition easing effect. So let's look at that. So there's the transition delay, which we wait, duration, how long it should take, and then also timing function. And so basically these are the algorithmic kind of shorthands for these certain transitions, how they should start. So for example, there's like a ease in, ease out. There's a linear progression, right? There's a step progression. And these all are different algorithms of how the transition is applied to the property, right? And so this is kind of a good example of what it means when I'm saying the algorithm, right? So this animation follows a certain kind of path based on the animation, how the algorithm's defined, right? And so you can change these, you can make your own custom ones, right? And change the way the behavior is. And so this is like a very nuanced difference to the animation, but with it you can do a lot of kind of very detailed timing stuff. So ease in and out. So you can see this animation duration. Let's change the duration back down to 2 seconds or 5 seconds. So the ease in out, right? It starts slow in the beginning and then goes faster and then slows down at the end. So these are lots of kind of little things that you can play with to get your animation to how you want it to behave. So that's one way of doing this, right? And the other one is actually by doing specific animation keyframes. And so this is probably, when you think about traditional animation, this is something that would seem more familiar when you talk about animation. And so basically you're setting an animation property and then you're defining the keyframes that should happen at each percentage of the animation. And so you could say, okay, at the very beginning I want it to be this color, then by 50% I want it to be this color, and then by the end I want it to be a totally different color. So for example, if you had a P tag here and you wanted to, in this case, it's like sliding into view of the frame. So the first part is the animation duration. So how long does animations last? And then the animation name. And so the animation name here called slide in is a variable. It's whatever you call it. And so you define this animation by using this new CSS definition keyframes. And inside of here, you set 0 to 100%, so you can have 0, 1, 2, 3, 5%, all the way to 100%. And for each one of those keyframes, you define what the CSS properties should look like at those keyframes. So let's try doing this with our current red box here. If we go back. And so what we need to do is, I'll get rid of the stuff that's there currently. We'll drop that out. And we'll get rid of the hover. And so what we need to do, right, is basically define a couple things. We're going to define the animation duration. And so this should take, we'll say it takes 10 seconds. And then we have to define a animation name. And we're going to call this color change. Right, this is a variable, so this could be whatever I want. It doesn't have to be anything. I'm just naming it something that makes sense to me. So now that we have this color change, right, nothing's happening. But what we can do is basically define the animation now, define the keyframes for it. So keyframes for color change. I'm going to say, okay, at 0%, we want to have the background be tomato. And let's add those width and height back into it. So at 0%, it should be tomato. So it's already starting to do some animations, but, and then we'll say at 100%, it should be background color blue. Right, so over the course of 10 seconds, so at 0 seconds, it's tomato, and then 100% seconds, it's blue. So at 10 seconds, it's blue. And so you see the animation kicked off immediately, right? As soon as the page loaded, because there was no trigger to the animation, right? It was not, there was no hover effect. There's nothing like that that added these animation properties to it. So just as soon as the page loaded and the CSS is applied, it started with the animation. So you could do pretty elaborate stuff with this, right? So you could have like a pretty tour of different rainbow colors here. So let's say 25. The background color should be green, and then by 75 it should be orange, and then by 100 it should be blue, right? So as soon as we refresh the page, we'd see the animations kind of cycle through the various keyframes, trying to get to that specific property value for that keyframe, eventually finishing the animation over the course of the animation duration property defined. And so again, you would need some way to kind of kick off these animations because it just triggers immediately when the page loads. So you could do something like have a specific class that has this animation associated with it, and add that class to the element or the property as soon as the event happens, like a click event or something like that in JavaScript. You could probably also do this with some sort of hover animation, right? So if we took the um, properties out that we had and we said animation div and only add these animation properties when there's a hover event, then when you hover over this, right, it would kick off the animation and go through its keyframe cycle. So you could have very elaborate hover animations or something like that. But again, these are just kind of like the raw tools that you could use various things to assign these animations to, including JavaScript. So those are the two kind of individual ways that you can use animations to get going, just by transitioning a single property or many properties across a set value, and then also with this much more nuanced and detailed keyframes definition. So there's a question of, okay, so you can transition or animate any property, but what are some good properties specifically for animating? And so I put a link in that has some examples of various properties that are useful to transition with or animate with. And so some of them are like scale, right? So this link has various examples of the various types of transition properties, or these are CSS properties that are good to apply animation to. So for example, this one is the scale property. So if you say scale or transform colon scale and then the value of the scale, you can do things like this. Another one is the transform rotate property, right? So if I wanted to add this to my animation, right, that I was working on, I could say, okay, at 0%, I want the transform rotate to be at 0 degrees. And then by the 100% mark, I want it to be at 1080 degrees. Let's see if that works. Right. So it's transforming the rotate, and it's being animated by the keyframes, right? Just by the transform rotate property changing between the two keyframes. And of course, you could do that using the other method of animating as well. So there's a rotate. There's also translate. So this is translate on the X and Y. So shift it over, skew, and you can also do the transformation origin. So where the transformation origin should apply to the element, right? Just applying it to the top left of this element. And then you can also mix them together. So these are kind of some of the good animation properties that you probably find useful. You will quickly run into the fact that this is really difficult to animate, right? It's like a lot of work to figure this out. So I put in a link to a little editor that kind of helps you build these animations quickly to test them out. And so these kind of come with some built-in animation types existing out there already. So like this vibrate animation, right? So it's always constantly kind of like doing this vibration. And so you can modify these properties, the CSS properties here on the left by changing stuff. And then when you're ready, you can get the source code and it will give you the class that you would need to apply and then the animation that you'd want to apply it to, right? So if I wanted to use this on the square I just made, right? So I'm going to copy this class, put it into my CSS. And I'm going to copy the CSS keyframes that it defined for me. put those in here too. So now I could go around and I could apply this vibrate one class to anything I wanted to have that vibrate animation. Right? So it's always there doing that vibration. So yeah, so this is a nice little tool if you want some more of like a visual interface to start building these things and develop some of these animations. But it's a good start. And the only other aspect we'd talk about is 3D transformation. And so 3D transformation is like it's a whole nother kind of area of work too. And so just as you can do these transformations in a two-dimensional plane, right? These transformations can also be done using the three-dimensional planes too. And so this tool kind of just demonstrates some of those 3D transforms that you can possibly do. So things like changing the rotation of it, right, on the x-axis. So you're actually like transforming in 3 dimensions an element. And so this is just a div, right? And so you can really transform these things in a 3D way that is pretty complicated, right? And so you could do a lot of interesting effects using 3D transformation. And so if you look at the CSS for these, just to rotate on the x-axis, for example, it is just kind of very straightforward CSS properties. Oh, sorry, CSS properties here at the bottom that are accomplishing this transformation. So these 3D things are much more complicated because you have to think of them in 3D space and how they interact and how they are displayed from your perspective as a 2D perspective looking into three-dimensional space. But they're there if you wanted to spend some time figuring out how to do this sort of 3D animation. If you do, I've provided a really great tutorial on how to get started doing 3D transformations. And so again, you'd have to really think about, when will this be useful, when this would be effective. So if you're doing a very immersive page with lots of kind of storytelling aspects of it, you probably would want to apply a lot of these transitions and even three-dimensional transitions maybe. But they're even just good to add a little polish to a button, when you click on a button and it gives you a little feedback saying it's been clicked, just a little animation. It's also very nice. So with these resources, you should be able to get started doing some basic transitions and some animations and even get into this more complicated 3D stuff. So until next time, thanks and take care. Bye.